Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Anna, a clinical psychology doctoral intern, and today we're going to be talking about a couple of studies on long-distance relationships. Specifically, do they last, which ones don't, what can you do to make them last, and what can you do when the relationship goes from long distance to geographically close to help strengthen it. So first I'm going to talk about some of the key points from the research articles, then I'm going to give you my own clinical and personal observations. After that, I'm going to give you the main takeaways from the articles and some tips for people who are in long-distance relationships who are about to become geographically close, but also what we can learn from long-distance research, even if you're not in one. You know, what couples in general can learn from the literature on long-distance relationships. And then actually, I have some questions for you, the audience, because I'm curious how the research on this topic matches my audience's experience. And if you are an OG follower, then you might recognize this topic, but I wanted to give it a revamp. Alright, so let's go into the key points from these two articles that I love so much. The older literature is contradictory, but more recent research suggests that long-distance relationships are just as strong or sometimes even stronger than geographically close relationships. It is not the geographical closeness that matters for determining whether a couple is going to last or how satisfied they are with each other, but rather the subjective experiences and attitudes of the partners involved in it. Long-distance relationships break up at similar rates to geographically close relationships. They're just as in love, they're just as satisfied, they have even lower levels of aggression and better levels of communication. What is associated with better outcomes for long-distance relationships? Well, we know that more face-to-face time is associated with increased trust. So if you're trying to decide between seeing them next week or seeing them the following week, go for the next week. Paradoxically, one of the studies said that greater distance is correlated with better outcomes for relationships. And there isn't a clear causality behind this because, like I said, it's paradoxical. We would expect it to be the opposite, where if you're just a little bit closer, then it's easier to cope with a relationship being long distance. Researchers suggest maybe it's due to cognitive dissonance. Maybe the distance helps people idealize their partner more. Maybe they are investing in other parts of the relationship more because they're afar and they don't have that many options. They can only focus on bettering emotional intimacy, communication, things of that sort. When you're far away, the time that you do get to spend together feels more precious. It's cherished more. When you're further away, you don't get to see your partner in everyday life, and so it's easier to idealize them. You don't get to see their flaws up close and personal. You can kind of picture them however you want to picture them. Or you might feel a need to overcompensate if your partner is very far away to make sure that the fire is alive in the relationship. One thing that the researchers didn't mention that I thought was an interesting theory is the idea that when you are closer together, it kind of begs the question, well, why aren't you in the same location? You know, if one person is living, let's say, 30, 45 minutes away from the other, why aren't they bridging that gap? So I wonder if that might be part of the reason why geographically distant but not that distant couples have bigger trouble than the ones who are really far away. Because the ones who are really far away, they understand, you know, if you're in London and the other person's in Dubai, it's going to be very difficult to see each other. It's the forces of nature against you. But if one of you is in London and the other's in Manchester, very different situation where there might be more of a pressure for one person to want the other to move to where they are. So that is one thing, that greater distance is associated with better outcomes. Less time between visits is associated with a better intimate life, shall we say. This certainly makes sense. A higher amount of certainty about what the future looks like, who is going to move where, when is the long distance piece of the relationship going to end, that is associated with better outcomes. A positive attitude towards long distance relationships. This was really interesting, but people who believed that long distance relationships can work and that they can be just as healthy and happy, they tended to have happier relationships in turn. They had high rates of relationship satisfaction and better communication. This also makes a lot of sense if you think about, for instance, someone going into a job interview. If they think that this job interview is going to be terrible, then it stands to reason that it's probably not going to be wonderful for them if they're going into it with that attitude. Same thing applies here. And those who manage their own psychological distress and who help their partner also manage theirs have lower amounts of overall distress in the relationship and higher amounts of relationship quality. So if while you are apart, you can sort of manage your own issues going on, that can be very helpful for the relationship. relationship. Now, when long-distance relationships turn into geographically close relationships, that is a huge turning point for these couples. Now, about half of long-distance relationships end up breaking up and half stay together, which is more or less typical for geographically close relationships as well. Of the ones who move to the same place, about a third break up within 3 months of being in the same place. This is interesting because a lot of people would think that by nature, bridging that gap, bridging that distance between couples will solve many of the issues associated with long-distance relationships, right? That actually turns out not to be the case because, while yes, certain issues disappear, new issues appear as well. People in this position often mention missing the novelty and the autonomy that came with being in a long-distance relationship. They no longer have as much freedom or privacy. They feel controlled. They feel like they need to check in with their partner. Things that initially was not possible for their partner to do when there was distance. You know, it's not like you can text your partner every second of the day like, hey, what are you doing? Can you come over when you're long distance? Couples that bridge that distance also find that they rediscover their partner, both positive and negative traits. They discover things that were special about their partner that maybe they didn't realize. They also start to see their partner's flaws on display a lot more. You can't idealize someone quite as well if they're right in front of you. You cannot project your fantasy onto them when they are there, a full-fleshed, multidimensional being that is proving you wrong. During this transition period, some couples drift away and others actually get closer, as you would expect. People find it a lot more difficult to balance the relationship with their other responsibilities now. Before, they didn't need to carve out as much time to see their partner. They could just go about their week, maybe make plans to see their partner in 6 weeks or 6 months or however long. But now that they're living in the same place, they have to keep into account the relationship as well, and that can add an additional responsibility. This turning point is also associated with increased conflict, increased jealousy. It makes sense, now that you are in the same location, you can maybe meet your partner's friends, see how they spend their time, see how they interact with other people, are they being flirtatious with other people? That is a lot of opportunity for jealousy to form. Before, what you didn't know couldn't hurt you. And the vast majority of couples experiencing this turning point, about 85%, say that they miss at least one aspect of the long-distance nature of the relationship. Whether it's the closeness that they got, ironically, by being distant, the anticipation or novelty, autonomy, time management, ease. Overall, the study talks about how moving to the same place is neither positive nor negative. It is a mix of both for most people. And there is that tension between connection and autonomy, which I'll get into a little bit more in a second. So this brings up something interesting, which is that separation can actually strengthen a relationship. It can make quality time feel a lot more special. You would think that this would make a couple last longer, right? That a couple who was initially long distance, who had that special aspect of their closeness, once they moved to the same location would have a far stronger relationship than the average couple. Actually, according to the research, this is not always necessarily the case, because once you become geographically close with that person, the things that maybe you didn't know about them become apparent. And it doesn't matter how emotionally intimate you were with someone when you weren't that close with them. If once you are close with them, you learn things that do not mesh well with you, that relationship is still going to deteriorate. So it's not always going to fare well in terms of commitment. It could strengthen the relationship while you're apart, but when that distance ends, that could mean that you're still not necessarily going to end up together. And this brings up an interesting question of is there ever a situation where you would stay long distance forever? I don't know many people that enjoy the longing for their partner that comes with being long distance, but let me know in the comments if this is something that you would ever do, if you would reap the benefits of being long distance forever with someone. Okay, so let's get into some clinical observations here. What have I noticed as a therapist working with largely young adults who tend to be in long-distance relationships more than older adults? If neither person wants to budge on where they want to live, on how they are going to close that distance between them, there is very little you can do to save a relationship. And I've seen this situation over and over again with couples where they're kind of figuring it out. Okay, what are we going to do? What is the future of our relationship? And when they realize that neither person is willing to budge, the relationship ends because there's not much else you can do. It's really just a matter of delaying the breakup. Something like this really is an incompatibility and a deal breaker for a lot of people because, like I mentioned, the vast majority of people are not going to want to be far away from their partner forever. I've also noticed that there's a ton of power struggle between deciding who gets to move where. There's a power struggle associated with the decision itself, but the decision itself also reflects a lot of the power dynamics in the relationship. So if one person tends to call all the shots and the other is more submissive, that becomes apparent in the way that they manage this turning point. When there's someone in a relationship who is very stubborn and unwilling to compromise, that reflects in the long-distance relationship decision. That person is probably not going to move where the other partner is. But it's not the location itself that's the problem, it's this person's stubbornness. And you might want to be so important to your partner that they're willing to make that sacrifice for you. So it can build a lot of resentment if you find out that that's not the case, especially if you were usually the one bending over backwards trying to accommodate them, and then they're not willing to do this big decision either. I do think that the distance can prolong that idealization phase that we associate with the honeymoon phase. But again, remember that idealization doesn't always result in long-term commitment. But when it does, boy does it feel awesome. So what are the takeaways from this literature? Your relationship is not doomed to fail if you are in a long-distance relationship. You have the same chance of making it as non-long-distance relationships do. And if you have this belief that long-distance relationships don't last, you might be shooting yourself in the foot. You might be setting yourself up for a self-fulfilling prophecy. Your attitude on this matters way more than the objective statistics. It matters more than how far away you are from your partner or who moves where when. Along the same lines, if your partner has this aversion to long-distance relationships or this belief that they don't last or just personally doesn't want to be in one, it's probably not worth it to try to convince them because they are that person that is most likely to not last in a long-distance relationship. So if you are trying to decide whether to move to different locations for a short or long period of time, don't try to convince them. If they say that they're not going to be happy in one, they're probably not going to be happy in one. So either try to not be far apart or just break up. And I've witnessed this firsthand in my personal life with people that say, I don't want to be in a long distance relationship. And it can feel a little bit heartbreaking for the partner that's hearing that because, of course, everyone wants to feel like they're so special to their partner that their partner would make that sacrifice for them. But honestly, it's not about you. It's about them, because I've seen this with couples who intend to even marry each other, who one person says to the other, no, I'm not going to be in a long distance relationship with you. If you move to this place, then we're going to break up. They're probably the type of person that wouldn't make that sacrifice for anyone. It's probably not personal to you. And if you want to be with someone who is willing to make that sacrifice for you, I'm sure that you can find someone who will. So just keep that in mind. Do try to get as much face-to-face time as possible and to visit each other frequently. Have very open conversations about when you're going to live in the same place and where that's going to be, and try to keep an open mind both for yourself and your partner. Try not to be too bogged down in uncertainty or in being very certain that one person doesn't want something. Plan for the future, try to find common goals and solutions together. Don't keep it a long-distance relationship indefinitely. Because remember, this might mean that it works right now while you're long distance, but that's not necessarily going to make you last once you're in the same location. And wouldn't you want to know that sooner rather than later? So do be aware that becoming geographically close after you were a long distance couple is a major turning point that comes with a lot of stressors and new challenges that you might not expect. It's not going to solve all your issues, far from it. For one, don't expect to have the same perks and independence that you had when you were long distance. If you want the connection associated with being close to your partner geographically, you're going to have to give from other things. Sometimes people think that they can have it all. They can have this super connected, emotionally intimate relationship and be super autonomous and independent all the time. It's not like that. You can't have 100% and 100%. Sometimes it's going to be a little bit of a push and pull. Yes, your partner might start wanting you to consider their schedule too when you're planning out your week. Yeah, they might get jealous by the way you interact with certain people in your life. Also, when you're going into this transitional period, try to remember that this idealized version of your partner that you have in your head right now is not necessarily realistic. You're going to learn certain things about them that might not be quite as favorable, that might shatter that fantasy a little bit. And remember that this is a full-fledged human being. They're going to have some flaws, and it's going to be your decision to decide, is this something that can work with me or not? But don't expect them to be perfect, and don't expect them to be a fantasy. Be prepared to deal with some of the scheduling difficulties that come with living in the same location as your partner. Expect that both yourself and your partner have multiple responsibilities that you need to prioritize. Be prepared for increased conflict and jealousy. Be prepared to feel like you're rediscovering your partner, both the great parts and the not so great parts. parts. It might feel like you're meeting your partner all over again. And do understand that the image they may have portrayed for themselves electronically, or the image that you had of them in your head, might be romanticized. Your partner may have withheld certain things about them that you might be a little bit shocked by. Also understand that this transitional period can result in either the escalation or the de-escalation of this relationship. So either you're going to get much more serious pretty quickly, or you're going to drift apart. And either one is fine, just let the dominoes fall where they will. All couples, whether they last or not, tend to experience less autonomy, increased conflict, more face-to-face time, increased jealousy. So just keep that in mind. The ones that will break up as a result of these changes are going to find that, in their opinion, their partner has a lot more negative traits that they're discovering rather than positive traits that they're discovering. They will feel more strongly about that loss of autonomy and actually end up decreasing the quality time together. Even if the face-to-face time doesn't necessarily decrease, the quality time could. And they will miss that novelty and anticipation that came with being in a long-distance relationship a lot more than the people who decide they really like being close to their partner. Regardless of whether or not you're long-distance or not, I think that this research can really highlight some ways to strengthen your relationship. Distance makes the heart grow fonder. We know that doing things apart for a while can help you come back together with new things to talk about, with new experiences, rather than just, if you spend every waking moment together and you have nothing to catch each other up on, it can feel a little bit like you're just living in tandem, like there's nothing new or interesting to share. So don't be afraid of those work trips or those girls' nights or those Sunday brunches. Those give you an opportunity to come back to your partner and share something interesting with them. When you do spend time together, make sure that it is quality time together and that it deepens your connection, not just mindlessly scrolling on TikTok when you're spending time together. Try to build a sense of novelty and anticipation in your relationship, whether it's trying out new activities, flirting throughout the day in anticipation for a date that you have coming up, talking about how excited you are for your plans, keeping things spicy. Make sure that anticipation and novelty is there even when you're in the same location. And lastly, respect each other's autonomy. Respect that the other person is going to have responsibilities and that you do as well, and time management might be a little bit of a workaround sometimes. Try to go into it playfully rather than really rigidly. So lastly, the questions that I have for you, feel free to answer these if they resonate with you. Have you been or are you in a long-distance relationship? What is it like? What was the outcome of that? Or if you don't know, what do you think it might be? Did you resonate with the findings of these studies? And specifically, I think I'm most curious about that transition from long distance to geographically close. If you made it to that stage, how did it change your relationship? Did you last or not? Hope you have a great day. Give this video a like and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more of this, and I'll see you soon.